right, Koto, let's start because there might be some people still trying to find the room. But welcome to everyone who made it, top marks, navigating this university campus, and thanks everyone who's joining on Zoom. I hope you can hear me on the Zoom. If you can't, or if anything's going wrong, please let me know. Keep an eye on the chat. This is a School of Psychology colloquium in the business school. I'm Ginny Braun. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology here at Waikato, the University of Auckland. Most of you know that, but that's for random people who might watch the recording in the future. This is a slightly shortened version of a keynote that I did for the Qualitative Methods in Psychology conference, which was earlier this month. So it's mostly oriented to qualitative research, but it goes broader than that. And what I've done in the last few weeks is resist adding new content as much as I possibly could. Extra talk on the basis of this. So I think it's going to be about 45 minutes, but I'll try and talk really fast. So it's bits of time for discussion. So when I saw Stanley Kubrick's 1964 political satire, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb as a teen, I marveled at its satirical genius because what Gen X teenager did not love satire? The film parodied Cold War fears of a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. The story told of an insane US Air Force Brigadier General who orders a preemptive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, and it ends in disaster, full-scale nuclear annihilation that will render Earth uninhabitable for 93 years. I chose to parody the title as it so beautifully evoked the tension I feel between concerns about generative AI and the massive normalizing push of GenAI into the space of not just everything, but specifically education and writing, and for the purposes of this talk, qualitative research. The year nah is my addition. So I'm going to reflect on and interrogate and try and unpack some of my instinctive reactions to GenAI, to disentangle what underpins my sense of disquiet in relation to it, and to explore whether there's anything justified in that position. It's a sort of flow with the ideas talk, but I will do my best to signal these key transition points. And spoiler alert, I don't reach a tidy position, but my engagement has not quietened my qualms. So first, like all good qualitative, let's situate ourselves. The current situation to me feels like one where AI is coming at qual research at a rate no human can keep up with. It's an overwhelming deluge. And indeed, the scholarly literature is already awash with advice on doing qualitative research with or by or using GenAI. And as GenAI has also rapidly become embedded into existing qual tech platforms, such QDAS platforms, and pretty much all tech, as we know, it's very much hard to avoid, even if you want to. So before QDAS, or external to QDAS, more generic GenAI programs like ChatGPT are being used for qual analysis, raising the question of, is GenAI hot or not for qual? The use of GenAI in data generation, what did I do there? Inadvertent, all good, thank you. All right, thanks. Screen sharing is paused.
Just press the resume button.
Brilliant, thanks for the top tip. Excellent. Maybe this is why I don't love AI, or maybe I need AI right now to help me with this talk. So is it hot or not? We'll reach a conclusion today. The use of GenAI in data generation is increasingly happening as well. Some, like Gibson and Beattie, have described unwelcome research participants, but some are also advocating for the use of silicon samples in human research, so replacing human samples with AI-generated data. I'm not really going to focus on data generation per se, but it's an important aspect of things for us to consider. So given that context, what's my engagement been prior to writing this talk? Until very recently, it was something like this, just trying to live my best life in context and hope it all goes away. But in reality, it was something more like this, a position of refusal to engage and to hope it would go away. I simply don't have enough spoons to deal with it. And I'm a bit irritated that people who've never before been interested in qual are suddenly excited by it because of tech. But the push into developing tech for qual is also not developed often by people who are qualitative methodologists. And that is a concern, given that there is widespread ignorance about what we might call a broad qualitative orientation or qualitative sensibility. So capacity, disinterest, a dash of irritation combine to produce a yeah, but I'm not interested response. Not an intellectually defensible position, but true nonetheless. However, I now inevitably get a question whenever I present about GenAI, at least one. Christina Silva noted that there is much false hope around AI and also horror and resistance to its implications for doing qualitative research. But she says, we must also recognise that many qualitative researchers, just like many students, are already and will continue to use it, regardless of the risks and consequences. We cannot hide from that fact. And she argues that we must understand what LLMs are and how they work to be able to assess whether and when their use may be appropriate or not within the qualitative workflow. We need to critically reflect on the implications and discuss them as a community of practice in transparent and respectful ways. So despite my trying to pretend that the horse didn't exist, the horse, it seemed, had already bolted, and it's actually a whole herd of horses, and I needed to chase after it. Silva recently posted on Blue Sky about not having a single qual model in our claims about GenAI, and that's really important. So I am trying to hold epistemological, ontological, methodological, and other variation in this talk. So in this context, Victoria Clark, who some of you know, and I reluctantly realised that we needed to engage. And this talk is a result of much conversation and reflection between us, as well as reading and watching and thinking and more. And it's my story around GenAI, but it's also a collaborative story. And as I've said, qual research, no context, and reflexivity are important. And so I'm going to try and deploy both of these throughout the talk to reflect on my resistance to and reluctant engagement with GenAI within the context of big Q qualitative research. First, I'm going to try and disentangle some shaping aspects that influence my or our engagement with and attempt to develop some sort of informed position in relation to GenAI. So in no particular order,
Hi.
I
am.
Something interesting. That wasn't what I'm including. I'm deeply concerned with the existential threat posed to humanity by our abuse of the environment. Even as I classify myself as a climate criminal, I am, in global terms, worse than most, but better than some. Thankfully, the tech bros are still doing lots to make me feel better about myself. I am a critical scholar, attuned to unpacking ideas and arguments, concerned with the particularities and productions of language and discourse, and concerned with power and the way power works. I'm a deep critic of neoliberalism, both in general and in relation to academia and universities and commercialisation thereof. I've become an invisibly disabled scholar whose engagement with scholarship is inflected by that. I'm old, comparatively. I'm not a digital native. I'm definitely not a Luddite, as people imagine Luddites to be. I'm not even tech negative. I love my phone way more than the next person. And I'm also not a naive defender of technology, and I'm quite wary of moral panic arguments in relation to technology that we see a lot of. And some of the criticisms around AI, I think, is being accused of being that. And I am also, as we all are, the product of contexts. So let's wind back the clock for a moment. Until my early teens, I lived in the most isolated of contexts, an ideologically countercultural childhood with only muted and occasional engagement with normative, dominant cultural norms and references. during a rare visit to my grandparents, an uncle took not yet teen me to see Blade Runner. Rated 13, not yet teen me, was terrified. I retain one vivid visual and emotional and psychological memory. The idea that you could not tell the human from the non-human was existentially unsettling and upsetting at the deepest level. I had nightmares about this film for months. And writing this talk has made me realize how much the rise of the machines and the threat they pose to humans has been part of the sociocultural scaffolding of my, and I will say every Gen X's, psychology. Released shortly after Blade Runner, The Terminator tells of a cybernetic assassin sent back from 2029, it's not that far away, people, to assassinate Sarah Connor because her son will save humanity from extinction by a hostile AI in a post-apocalyptic future. AI is not our friend. AI is not to be trusted. Somewhere later, the massively culturally influential The Matrix and subsequent films depict a reality of a dystopian future in which humanity is effectively enslaved to intelligent machines. So fair to say, sociocultural influences such as these ready me to be existentially unsettled by both the intent and the purpose of AI and GenAI. And it's useful to recognize that and to question whether my engagement starts from this position of existential anxiety and uncertainty, and to unpack whether that disquiet simply reflects that existential anxiety. The machines may indeed be out to get us. Don't tell them we know. Or something potentially more valid, which does not preclude, of course, that they might still be out to get us. Having co-developed a popular approach to qualitative research and having some kind of influence, the question of the value of GenAI is also something I have skin in. And so another question is my reaction to this also somehow just about trying to protect turf? Can I really be open to the possibility that GenAI has a lot to offer? And such important reflexive questions can never fully be answered by humans. We have an obligation to try, but we can never get to a final answer, nor could AI, I will say. So what kind of skin do I have? I am, by values and preference, decidedly non-positivist. Victoria and I find the concept of big Q useful to convey this. Big Q refers to research that is qualitative in values, processes, and claims, non-positivist. There's much variation from that foundation point. And that's without going into a whole domain of post-qualitative, post-humanist, new materialist, and other approaches and evolutions that are happening in this space. Situated within and drawing on critical theory, my approach to qual has never been a realist experiential project. As a critical qualitative scholar, my engagement has been framed primarily within and through individualist Western epistemologies and ontologies, and various other indigenous onto-epistemologies, and more orient to a less human-centric and individualist way of thinking about sense-making, but I simply cannot go into those in the time that we have available. Then there's what sociologist Deborah Lupton recently articulated on LinkedIn as an orientation to inevitability. I read her post with a bit of an oof moment, recognizing that in my refusal, there is also a sense of futility, a sense that it will happen whether I form an opinion or not, so why bother? But although it may feel futile at times, impossible to imagine anything other than a steady march towards the inevitable supremacy of AI, it is only that. I'm quoting this report. It is only that, a feeling. It is not reality, at least not yet. So we should still bother. Another strand of my reluctance to tackle this relates to the sheer scale of GenAI and qual. How can we seriously tackle this when also overwhelmed with impossible workloads and exhausted? The neoliberal university model has not encouraged an academia where scholars have time to think, to explore in ways that isn't tied to inputs, funding, and productive outputs, articles, and so on. Then there's the bigness of the task itself. So much to read, so much thinking to do. Then there's so many alsos in this talk, the bigness of the questions it raises. And I think that we're approaching a point of existential threat for qualitative scholarship. Having fought so hard to have our ontological, epistemological, axiological, and methodological approaches given validity from post-positivist quantified norms, we now face a different kind of threat. Some would call it an opportunity. And I think there are layers to this existential threat. One is the value proposition threat. What do we as humans have to offer as qualitative researchers if AI can do it faster and much, much cheaper, at least in monetary terms? Another existential threat relates to the question of what qualitative is to scope and dimensions. And there is a very real risk that qualitative becomes reframed as simple information extraction from words, rather than a more complex, messy, disentangling, entangling, and sense-making process. And having fought to have our mess somewhat accepted, we will again have to waste time and energy validating a process that isn't about getting to the truth of words or meaning, a debate that is not of our making. So within the space of qual methodologists broadly, and GenAI, there are some who are informed refuseniks, some enthusiasts, some cautious and nuanced adopters, and some who are confused, uncertain, or deeply concerned. And I've noticed a trend in recent weeks for people who express concerns at the limits or application of GenAI to or within or for qual to be told some version of "you just don't understand," or "if it doesn't work for you, you're doing it wrong." Neva Boyevich from Kedge Business School in Bordeaux posted on LinkedIn about an experience with a recent post on qual and GenAI with forceful pushback against their caution, commenting as if hesitation and reflection equal ignorance. Such qualitative scholars or anyone in academia's reluctance is simply a matter of not understanding or not getting with the times. What resources do we have for critical, reflective engagement if those are the types of responses we get? I hope this talk provides thoughts for reflection, maybe clarification, and ongoing discussion about these important issues. That's my intro. There's a chat there. Are they saying anything important? Okay, didn't read it. It's not that it's not important, I just can't multitask. Right. So I was watching Murderbot when I wrote this talk, for anyone who recognizes the image. My existential fear has clearly not put me off the sci-fi genre. Having considered multiple points of context, I want to raise a few layers of different, sometimes entangled aspects to think through as we work through this. These will be what we imagine qual is for, what realities are being constructed, what we imagine the human is, tensions and issues related to neoliberal academia, ableism, and what I'm calling the push-pull of criptime. Criptime as a concept challenges normative or conventional understandings of time and framings, and the situation of people and time as kind of linear and uniform and are shared by all individuals' experiences, but instead emphasizes the complex, contextual, and variable ways that disabled people perceive, experience, and navigate time and time norms and time expectations. And I'll also touch on ethics and impact. So there seems to be an assumption in much of the enthusiastic uptake of GenAI and work that promotes it, that there is a problem with qualitative and qualitative research, and we need to fix it. But what is that problem? The problem is not one that I, as a qualitative methodologist, understand as a problem. Paulus and Moroney analysed the discourses of websites, of QDAS companies incorporating AI into their programs, and described discourses constructing AI as an automated tool that can be used to unveil pre-existing truths that are just waiting to be discovered, which read as a stark contrast to the careful, gradual, interpretative meaning-making typically carried out by the human instrument of the study. It's a quote from another scholar, that has been the strength of qualitative approaches. So the problem seems to be subjectivity, partiality, nuance, based in an idealization, an assumption of realist extraction of information from participants that can and needs to be verified and validated, rather than analysis as a meaning-making engagement between researcher, data, and sometimes participants as co-researchers. In a QDAS panel discussion, Paulus noted that the problem AI is apparently solving is the problem of being human, and she laughs, the problem of being slow. She added that AI discourses are often posed as solving problems with qual that she also understands is treated inherently in qual and which she doesn't see as a fundamental problem. She argued that if we're engaging with data from humans, we need experience as humans to make sense of them. We need subjectivity. And I, unsurprisingly, find it hard to disagree. Paulus and Moroney suggested that QDAS website discourses may encourage or even seduce researchers into diminishing their agency in the interpretative process, as new tools promise highly automated coding, interpretation, and insight generation, and signaled this as a particular risk to those new and learning qualitative research. I am really interested in the productivity of technology and the discourses around it and what that might mean. As part of a scholarly debate as to whether ChatGPT is bullshit, theorised concept, not the colloquial term, Gunkel and Cochrane argued LLMs and similar forms of AIs are powerful technologies, and we need to be attentive to the exigencies of their actual operations and critical of the material, social, epistemological, and moral consequences. But just as powerful are the words, the names, terminologies, metaphors, analogies, and descriptions that we select and employ in these various endeavours. So part of my deep dive into GenAI involved interrogation of the ideas and ideals and assumptions and desires of and for qualitative research. And we're at an interesting time where ontological claims are being thrown about in order to construct objects of difference. And we need, I think, to be really cautious about the truths we inadvertently or deliberately produce through the language we use about GenAI. So what truths are being put together in this evolving discourse and marketing hype around GenAI and qual? I'm just going to focus on a couple of these, or really one. One of these is that qual without AI is a chore. Susanna Fraser, for instance, who has developed an approach to analysing qual data using LLMs and without coding, regularly describes coding in ways that construct it as a chore, a grind, and something undesirable. She says, ask yourself, why did we need to code in the first place? Not because we wanted to, but because we had no better way to manage and make sense of data, but now we do. Through such language, a certain task of critical engagement potential in some qualitative approaches is positioned as a tiresome and odious no longer necessity. And I think it's interesting that coding, which is a task that GenAI does not do well in relation to qualitative research, gets positioned particularly as tiresome and tedious, rather than engaged, creative, and pleasurable. It's easy to throw out the baby when the baby's a monster that no one wants. So Paulus and Moroney finished their paper with a future-focused reflection, given the rapidly evolving GenAI landscape, which has evolved since I wrote this talk. They say, we're aware that this study may sound just like Grandpa Simpson yelling at the clouds in just a few years due to advances in AI technology. Nevertheless, methodological rigor and human agency and qual research will always be worth consideration through a reflective and critical stance. No matter how shocking it may sound to future readers, some qualitative researchers actually enjoy doing the heavy lifting, finding thought-provoking and meaningful what others consider a headache. So the choriness of these tasks is not necessarily something inherently true. There seems to be a polarization. Just check these chats. No, nothing that I need to pay attention to. There seems to be an evolved polarization between those who attempt to replicate an approach or an imagined approach, importantly, to qualitative, often thematic analysis, based on a process from familiarization through coding and then into something else. And those who argue that this is fundamentally the wrong way to go about it. A small group of scholars, including Susanna Fraser, David Morgan, and Kien Nguyen Trong, apologies for the terrible pronunciation, are embracing or advocating for the use of GenAI, arguing for what is positioned as a paradigm shift into a non-coding oriented way to qual based on some kind of dialogic engagement with GenAI. Situating GenAI as a kind of conversational research partner or collaborator, but where their usefulness hinges on human researchers remaining firmly in control. Susanna Fraser argued that we're witnessing the emergence of new paradigms for working with unstructured data. We're beginning to see how real-time interaction with data can enable more flexible, layered, and responsive inquiry. Describing GenAI as tools for epistemic expansion. The value of LLMs, at least in part, is because they are large and bring their vastness, the vastness of their training to the analytic process. Fraser also argued that these developments compel us to revisit what counts as qualitative knowledge. Must it always stem from human immersion alone, or can it arise from orchestrated interactions with systems that mirror, provoke, and extend human sense-making? The epistemological terrain is shifting, she says, from individual hermeneutics, interpretative frameworks, to distributed intelligence, from solitary interpretation to dialogic co-analysis. In this space, knowing is less about ownership and more about orchestrating meaningful epistemic encounters between researcher, data, and AI model. So unlike many who are promoting GenAI on qual, these methodologists are engaging from perspectives of qualitative understanding. However, I still think it's worth asking if the technological opportunity is inherently always an improvement. David Morgan suggested that his approach is best suited to replace the approach we've built up as a method for reflexive TA, but argued there's likely to be resistance, me being resistant right here perhaps. He said qualitative researchers who have relied on coding may treat AI as a contradiction to their accustomed ways of doing things, rather than as a relief from the time-consuming tedium of coding. Just to come back to that idea that coding is such a chore. I'm sure some of my students will confirm that coding is a chore. Overall, if it can be shown that AI-based analyses produce results that are as good as those from coding at a fraction of the time and expense, then their efficiency cannot be ignored. If efficiency were the only consideration, that may be the case, but for me, it's not. In accounts which dismiss coding, it is often evoked as a mode for identifying the already known, not as a tool and process of critical interrogation and meaning making and unmaking through deep and close engagement. Fraser, for instance, argued that what is gained by moving to AI away from coding is a reorientation of analytic labor from mechanical segmentation towards conceptual synthesis. For those willing to step beyond coding and embrace AI as a collaborative sense-making partner, her approach, he says, offers a compelling alternative. Its promise lies in its capacity to deepen interpretation, democratize analytic access, and expand the epistemic horizon of qualitative research in the age of artificial intelligence. I admit, somewhat irritated when GenAI collaborative research gets positioned as superior to human alone research and evoked subtly, I admit, and I could be accused of slightly overreading the situation here, as a liberator of the qualitative scholar from the tedium and shackles of coding. And I fear that examples of the worst of qual as a mechanical extractive approach are being used to legitimize and indeed promote the use of GenAI in ways which set it up as transcending imagined flaws of the past. So evocation of a new paradigm is of course not inherently problematic, but it does come with the risk of suggesting that the existing or the soon-to-be old is tired and past it, time for retirement, or only found among those too daft or recalcitrant to realise the potential of the shiny new approach. It potentially positions those who can't or won't use GenAI as deficient. I've also been seeing reference to having conversations with GenAI framed as a way of avoiding what is claimed to be the isolation and loneliness of qualitative analysis. And I think this works to position qual research individually enacted as potentially a threat to mental health, tying into constructions of a loneliness epidemic, which we're seeing a lot of, and perhaps situating AI within a saviour discourse. We're also seeing this around loneliness in human life and mental health issues in human life much more generally. What productive ontologizing work does such discourse around GenAI and qual do? Others argue, as noted by Paulus, that some who advocate for GenAI and qual seem to want to resolve the problem of human subjectivity or bias. Although as AI itself is also flawed, perhaps both are needed. And there is a recommendation that they can cancel out the flaws of each other. And in this, much GenAI discourse remains premised on a post-positivist realist approach, whereby there is one true reading of data and a more or less accurate account of it. So which brings me back to the nub of the question, what qualitative is this when we're talking about qual and AI? The Financial Times recently highlighted new research on why GenAI hasn't taken your job yet. That indicates it doesn't struggle with intellectual complexity, specialized skills or knowledge, or messy workflows, but with messy workflows and unclear goals. And for me, messiness is an inherent part of qual, and unclear goals are also often the case a lot of the time. We create some sort of order, yes, but isn't creating mess part of the way of getting to understanding? Can we think of messy workflows as an analogy for qual? And if we do, where does that situate us? As entanglers, disentanglers, and re-entanglers. But back to chores. In a recent New York Times article on the use of GenAI in history, where someone described using it to plan to structure a new book, one author responded to the idea by commenting, "To turn to AI for structure seems less like a cheat than a deprivation, like enlisting someone to eat your hot fudge sundae for you." For those of you who enjoy qual, you'll understand what's going on. This got to the heart of my disquiet in terms of the productivity of GenAI discourse. A construction of tasks as unpleasant necessities before GenAI, now able to be handed over to GenAI. If we take seriously the idea that nature of objects and more is not inherent or predetermined, that we're producing stories about qual scholarship that have the potential to become truths, we need to be wary of the constitutive nature of our discourse in relation to qual and in relation to learning and education and so on much more generally. So this highlights the importance of reflexive consideration of what ideas and norms we embed in the language we choose, something we as humans can and should reflect on. Amy Grant and Helen Cara recently emphasised the ableist and neurotypical norms that are embedded in much discourse about qual, the expectations about what is and is not challenging. And the same happens as we debate the role of GenAI in qual, because a description is never just a description. And as we are probably not yet fully enslaved to the machines, why do qual if it is so tedious? Qualitative methodologist and fellow at the Centre for Advanced Internet Studies in Germany, Janet Sammons, noted, "If you don't like doing this, maybe you're in the wrong place." And personally, I don't recommend qualitative as a path where the short-term pain is worth it for some longer-term goal. It is not the way for hyper-productivity. So on that note, back to productive objections. We know that productivity is a peak goal of neoliberal academia in tension with qual scholarship. Paulus and Braun noted that the most prevalent discursive construction of the role of AI was of increased speed. The ideal research outcome, it is suggested, is one that can be completed quickly. High speed is valued over high engagement with data. They describe that the claims and promises around high speed is hyperbolic, and GenAI becomes neoliberal academics' ultimate helper and friend. But another important question about the impacts of GenAI is not just for the individual, but in terms of how we respond and engage, and how our individual choices impact others. What are the collective implications of our individual acts? And that's partly why I decided to redo this talk here today. As GenAI can be understood as a vital language for creating shared realities and tackling collective challenges, we need to think it more publicly and more collectively as we engage with it. Mike Anani, a journalism and communications scholar in Southern California, argue we need a public, not commercialized conversation about AI and question of what realities, possibilities, and more being produced in and through the particular emergence and use of GenAI. For scholars, costs and consequences should be considered in terms of what norms get produced, what through language and practices and so on, and the expectations that flow on from those. Those who adopt GenAI and promote efficiency and speed as a benefit are basically promoting fast academia and kind of pissing on the rest of us, undermining our capacity to legitimately claim the time and effort it takes to do good in-depth, interrogative, reflexive, interpretative, qualitative analysis or work in general without GenAI. And that's even if we're operating in normie time, not criptime. The speed and efficiency hype of GenAI operates in profoundly ableist ways, even as it may be assistive at the same time for some in some ways. Two things can be true at once. It does no favours to the expectations and norms about what is and isn't desirable, or to quality and diversity in terms of what qualitative scholarship can offer. So for us as a community of scholars, this needs to not be a private conversation or just an individual choice, but a broader reflection, a collective conversation. What are we doing? What are we creating? What and who are we precluding? With the rush to embrace GenAI, we're being asked to trust the machines, which sci-fi has taught us is a very bad plan. At the same time as the flaws in the machines are acknowledged. There has been extensive coverage of GenAI's algorithmic biases, following and exacerbating human biases and prejudices. And I wrote that before Grok evolved itself into Hitler. Then there's the hallucinatory or falsity of GenAI responses, which are not reducing. Rather, the newest and most powerful technologies are generating more errors, not fewer. And as their math skills have notably improved, their handle on facts has apparently gotten shakier, and it's not entirely clear why. So to me, algorithmic biases are a bit irrelevant to the question of qual analysis because, as we talked about, humans are also biased. But the hallucinatory aspect seems to bring a new problem in, and one that we don't need. The solution that gets proposed is that we must know our qualitative data really well to be able to ascertain what are the hallucinations and what are useful results. But I fail to see what gets added then. If we have to know our data well, why don't we just do the analysis? Especially if we're doing small, non-positivist qual projects. So I come back to the question of the value of the human, to whether there's anything unique and important about the human that we bring to our scholarship. And I question whether my strong yes response just reveals how deeply embedded I am in individualist, Western, Cartesian, supremacist fantasies, or is there something more in this? Paulus and Moroni noted that as an interpretative method for humans to study other humans in naturalistic contexts, qualitative inquiry acknowledges the essential role of humans as the interpreter of data and overall sense maker. Christina Silva recently situated interpreted intelligence as a core human skill in qualitative analysis, and concluded that it can appear because of how impressive GenAI is that it is interpreting data, but it is not, and it cannot do that. Some have argued that relying on such tools constitutes both an abdication of our responsibility as researchers and involuntary diminishment of our own agency and human consciousness required in the construction of knowledge. And to me, reflexivity is also at the heart of both interpretation and humanness, and nothing I've read suggests that GenAI can do the layered reflexive work that humans can. Humans don't always, but they have the potential. So can GenAI work for reflexive TA? David Morgan and many, many others, far too many others, suggested it is a good tool for doing reflexive TA. Most literature has oriented to the question of can and how good is GenAI at doing TA, and with an inferred kind of question of does it get analysis right? The question does not make any sense conceptually if there is no right to be got. To look into this further, Victoria asked ChatGPT if it was a good idea to get GenAI to do reflexive TA. It helpfully replied that it can be a good idea, depending on context and level of complexity, and noted that there are benefits and challenges. It then highlighted only the pros: speed and efficiency, initial coding and organization, categorizing, consistency and objectivity, and exploring data at scale, all aspects we do not emphasize as valuable for reflexive TA. It stated it's better to use AI to do some tasks so that the human can do others, and advocated a sequential model where GenAI does the grunt work. And humans offer the insights that GenAI cannot get to. So we concur with GenAI on this latter point. It's a good point. And we don't think that GenAI can do reflexive TA because it is a human, reflexive, subjective, situated method, and GenAI does not offer you that. I thought when I started this engagement that the question was going to be that, can GenAI do a good enough job of reflexive TA? Are we redundant? But I don't think that is actually the question. And I think we risk asking the wrong questions about GenAI and qual and scholarship in universities if those are the sorts of questions that we ask. Oops, so for me, the question is not can we use GenAI to analyze qual data, or even how can we use it, but depending on what we think qual A is, because of that, clearly we can use it to do something. But rather, I think the question needs to be, should we use GenAI to analyze qual data? So let's turn more explicitly to other reasons I think the answer or the should we question needs more attention beyond the existential threat to qual that I've talked about and the productive consequences that I've highlighted. This is me coming to the end of the talk. And these are questions of ethics and impact. Davison argued that researchers should engage in critical reflexivity and vigilance to identify, understand, and robustly address the ethical issues regarding the use of GenAI in qual analysis. And we don't want a situation where people think it's normal, yet explicitly and implicitly normalizing is being pushed and happening. And some of the wide range of ethical questions can be managed, but some are more philosophical and moral. And scholars like Janet Salmons and others push us to confront what our ethics are around the uptake of GenAI, when there's so much that's problematic about it, asking us to respond to not why would we choose it, but how could we choose it? It's a different justification. We know the environmental impacts of GenAI are huge, both for electricity and water, offering in future and in now eco and human catastrophe risk that seems destined to just get worse. Yet the environmental impacts of GenAI are siloed as an entirely separate discussion from the question of can and how should we use it for qual. Those who explore or promote its use in academia widely typically don't consider this in the equation either, such as here at a much touted sustainability university, there appears to be an almost total lacuna around discussion of environmental of GenAI as we rush to embrace it across teaching and research. To me, the massive ecological impact of new tech in contexts where there's no need for it and what it offers seems wrong, and at odds with the kind of social interest or social justice orientation that motivates many of us. And many of us are motivated by a vision of a better, more just world. And GenAI feels at odds with that ethos. Now, there's something morally comforting in taking an environmental objection position to GenAI when I continue to fly, as I said. But being eco-perfect is surely not a requirement for being concerned about something that is this big and this new. There's also the fact that GenAI has been trained on the illicit use of copyrighted materials. Now, we can and should critique for-profit academic publishing, but we can also understand as we do that, that training AI in this way on these sorts of materials is simply wrong. And Janet Salmon's position, this is fundamental in rejecting GenAI on the basis of ethics, asking how can you be a person with integrity while knowingly use tools that were based on stolen materials? And embracing GenAI for all the things we don't need it for, we implicitly endorse these actions, sending big tech a clear message. In a deep dive into OpenAI, Karen Howe observed that she only found one metaphor that encapsulates the nature of what these AI power players are, and that is empires. She writes that during the long era of European colonialism, empires seized and extracted resources that were not their own, exploited the labor of the people they subjugated for their empire's enrichment. She said the empires of AI are not engaged in the same overt violence and brutality that marked colonial history, but they too seize and extract precious resources, the work of artists and writers, the data of countless individuals posting about their experiences and observations, the land, energy, and water required to house and run massive data centers and supercomputers. And so too do the new empires exploit the labor of people globally to clean, tabulate, and prepare for data for spinning lucrative AI technologies. So AI developers were not selective. OpenAI was trained on databases that included the worst of humanity. And that is now being removed by humans in low-income countries in the global south who are exposed to the worst of humanity as they scrape clean source materials for LLMs like ChatGPT. So these are important questions, and that's even without getting into the whole AI and warfare side of things, to come back to the bomb at the start. My reflexive engagement has brought me to more rather than less reluctance to incorporate GenAI into qual research, very much a nah, not so much a yeah position. And I don't think this just reflects a deep distrust of the machines, so much bigger questions of productivity of things, the power of the tech billionaires and their agendas, and on reflection and interest in the small, the particular, and the nuanced. I realized the idea of scale that GenAI promises apparently holds no appeal. I wasn't drawn to qualitative for big generalities and big arguments. As Davison et al. Observed, speed and comprehensiveness do not necessarily translate into appropriateness, substantive helpfulness, or insightful understanding. But it can seem overwhelming and inevitable. And I want to finish with on an upbeat note that not everyone is succumbing. If I learned anything else from sci-fi, it's that resistance matters. We need to provide spaces of resistance so that those who don't wish to comply, don't wish to embrace or succumb to the AI empire can see alternatives. Instead of complying, we can take positions of conscientious objection. Janet Salmon's put it simply, we need to be better and take a moral stand about the work we do. She positions herself as taking a radical stance and saying, I just wouldn't use it in scholarly work, period. That is conscientious objection. One argument against this might be the hypocrisy one. Who am I to call out and call for avoiding the use of GenAI when I also do things that are ecologically and socially harmful? Apart from generally disliking moral purity type arguments and finding them counterproductive, I think this is different. The rise of this tech has been swift, from its emergence into the everyday to widespread inclusion in our life worlds. But the corresponding narratives of harm and risk are also visible, so we know. We cannot claim ignorance, and that I think is one place that this is markedly different to lots of other things. And we are arguably still on the cusp of every-awareness, not quite there yet. But those who don't engage and participate are being positioned as being left behind, out of touch, surplus to requirement, soon for the dustbin of history. I'll see you there, some of you, hopefully. Even where there is an initial let's wait and see position, like at this university, there now seems to be a complete acquiescence, if not outward embrace of it. It's like we're all enthusiastically or reluctantly rolling over for a good belly rub, not caring about what shit we might be rolling in. With institutions and tech platforms so enthusiastically incorporating AI, conscientious objection becomes a much harder ask. But resistance is happening from this letter from Dutch scholars to hacks removing GenAI from the world's favorite, if politically problematic, search engine, to calls for decomputing as a mode of resistance. There are other ways of engaging, and we need to make those visible. Resistance matters because the norms it sets will become the norms we're judged in relation to, such as productivity and workload, something we've been struggling to be taken seriously on at this university for a long time. How soon will workload models become normed on GenAI speed, not human speed? So to come back to notions of ableism, norms, and criptime, what space does this leave for the non-productive scholar up against expectations set not just against normie human speed, but GenAI speed? Dagmar Monet, who's the head of computer science at a university in Germany, posted a link to the AI Now landscape report I cited earlier and concluded that silence, inaction, and submission are choices. So I'm going to leave us to ponder that. And whether my qualms have substance or I am, just like Grandpa Simpson, waving my fist at the clouds. So thank you for coming and listening, and I'm sorry it took so long.